Chapter 1 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The first thing that I can recollect is that I was very long lying in a box in Soho Bazaar, till one day I was taken down by one of the shopkeepers and shown to a very pretty little girl, about 3 years old, who, after looking at a whole case though, chose me. This little girl had flaxen curls and was dressed very prettily. Her name was Lucy Fitzhenry. She wrapped me up and carried me home to her house in the country, which was a very pretty country seat. 2 or 3 days after she had me, her nurse cut some very pretty clothes for me. My underclothes were of very fine linen, and my dresses of flowered muslin, blue merino, and spotted calicos. My mother was very careful of me. She washed me every morning, for I was a porcelain doll, and dressed me and undressed me at night. One day she took me into town to see the Queen and Prince Albert, which I enjoyed very much indeed. As we were coming home in the carriage, little Lucy let me drop out of the window upon some burdock leaves, where I lay for some time. After I had lain there for about 2 or 3 hours, I was picked up by a little raspberry picker, who was German, named Joanna Wursel, who was overjoyed to find such a beautiful doll, and went instantly to show her brother, Robertson, who was also very glad. They then agreed to wrap me up in a cloth in which they had brought from their dinner, and there I lay until night, and thought over my past life, how my little mother Lucy had been so kind to me, how she had taken me out, ducked me in a little stream, and then dried me in the sun, laughed with me, kissed me, and talked about my new mamma, when suddenly a gust of wind took my cloak off, and I laid there very cold. However, my mother came very soon and took me up. "Poor doll," she said, "how very cold she must be." And therefore she wrapped me up in my dress very tightly, and then we went home. Their home was in a little building. It was once an outhouse, but the house had been removed, and it stood alone, where we had a very nice supper of watercresses, bread, and cheese. After that I was covered over with some leaves, and there I went to sleep. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Early next morning, my mother woke me up and carried me to the field. After a while, she spoke to her brother Robertson and said, "Robbie, don't you think that I better go and give this little dolly to Emma Arthurst?" "Yes," said Robertson, "for don't you know how kind she was to us?" So off they started to give me to Emma, who was about 5 years old. Little Emma was delighted and gave Joanna a half-crown. My mother, Emma, had another doll whose name was Ellen Green. By the by, I never had any name till my new mother gave me one, which was Josephine Arnoldson. But I think to this day that she was a very naughty doll, for she always spilt her tea on her dress, knocked down chairs, danced on the table, and I don't know what else. One day, my mother came and took me early from my nice little bed and dressed me in a beautiful frock of white muslin with a pink sash and violets and other flowers in my sash. I had seen my mother working on something for some time, and now I knew what it was. My mother then told me that it was May Day, and that I was to go to a May party, but she said that Ellen should not go because she had behaved so naughty. At first, I was glad to hear this, but after a while, I felt differently and begged my mother to let her go. Whether my mother could not withstand my pleading, or had determined to try Ellen once more, I don't know, but she at last consented to take Ellen. My mother was dressed in white, and so were a great many other little girls. We enjoyed ourselves very much, but at last Ellen began to behave badly. She tore a hole in her dress, and at last she acted so badly that my mother had to put her in the hollow trunk of a tree where we left her. Then we all went into a clump of the most beautiful pine trees and ate our dinner there. After that, we played around, and then we went home, not without taking Ellen with us. I had stayed with my present mother about 6 months when I was taken sick, the account of which I will defer to my next. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. One night as I was lying in my bed, my head began to swim, my lips were parched, and I felt very sick. After passing the night in great distress, my mother came to me and said, "Dear little Josie, how sick you look!" And so she did not take me up. By and by, the little girl who played the most with Emma came in and said, "Why, Emma, you have not taken your doll up this morning." "No," said Emma, "she is very sick, and so I did not think it best to take her up." "Well," said the other girl, "I will be a doctor, and you must send for me to come and attend your doll." So Emma sent, and the little girl came and ordered me some pills and a powder, which I was to take. They made the pills out of bread and the powder out of a stale pencil dust. I took these, and they quieted my pain some, but still I was very sick. The next morning, the doctor came over and ordered me something else, which I took as in duty bound, although I must say it did not taste very good. After 2 or 3 weeks, I began to get a little better, and then Ellen came and saw me. But she began to talk in her old way about having new dresses, and she having to take mine, for she and I were the same size, and her having to stay in the trunk while I enjoyed myself. And then she ended by saying that she was glad I was sick, for now she could have her own way, as she had before I came. I found out afterward that my mother had been telling Ellen about me, and saying that I was a pink of perfection, and that she ought to pattern by me. So Ellen hated me heartily, which I was sorry for, as I had sort of a liking for her, although she did behave so badly. One evening, after tea, Emma having left the room, her father said, "Wife, I think that as Emma is old enough to help us, that she had better begin next week about the dairy and help you. She will have to dispense with her dolls, and I think that she had better give her prettiest doll to her cousin, who I dare say will like it." When Emma came in, her father told her his intentions, and how she had better give the handsomest doll to her cousin Celeste. Emma cried very much at leaving her doll, and so did I, but she thought it better to do so. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Next day, Emma dressed herself very neatly and rode over to her cousin's, which was about 5 miles from her father's house. Emma cried all of the way, and I, in spite of myself, could not help crying too. At last we arrived at a very splendid mansion house, where Emma's cousin lived. Her aunt was very glad to have Emma come, and Celeste was very much pleased with her doll, although she said that she was almost too old to have a doll. By and by, Emma went home, and I was left in the hands of my new mamma. She then called her brother, Maximum Belmont, to see her doll, which he thought was very pretty indeed. My last mother had told me that her aunt was a baroness, and her uncle was a baron, which I was very glad to hear, as I thought I should see some very high life. The next day, my new mother went out with her governess to buy some things for me, and as they could not buy anything fit for me in the country, they went into town. They went to the very same place where I was first bought by my first mamma, Lucy, and bought me a swinging bed, with mattress and all complete. Also, a tea set, bureau, piano, a set of polar furniture, and a most beautiful bracelet, necklace, ring, and a pair of earrings. We next drove to a jeweler's and had my ears pierced, and the bracelet was marked Josephine Arnoldson. I forgot to say that my mother had bought me a most beautiful little house that I could live in, and had it carpeted, papered, painted, and furnished. The next day, my mother's governess cut out some dresses for me. I had morning dresses, afternoon, visiting, riding, party, and ball dresses. My party and ball dresses were so very handsome indeed that I think I must let my readers know what I had. My party dress was a pink silk, looped up in front, showing a white satin skirt embroidered up and down with flowers all over the silk. My ball dress was a white satin with white carp over it, and a small bouquet down the front, white kid gloves, an embroidered handkerchief, white silk stockings, and white satin slippers. Also, a most beautiful wreath of orange flowers and forget-me-nots for my hair, for I had real hair that curled. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Memoirs of a Country Doll by Mary Curtis. Gardening. One day I observed my mother put on her things very slyly, call her governess and tell her to put on her things also, and come out. I thought to myself, what can this mean? My mother has put on her clothes, called the footman and ordered the carriage, and has taken her governess with her. I guess it is something that I am not to know, for if it were not, I certainly would have gone with her. As I did not feel very well, I thought that I would lie down on my bed and take a nap. In a couple of hours my mother came home, and coming into the room where my baby house was, took me out of the bed without saying a word to me about her having been out. I burned all the time to know what she had been out for. I could hardly eat my dinner, and when tea came I could eat nothing. The next day at 12 a man rang at the hall door, and my mother ran down to let him in, a thing that she had never done before, and which made me so curious that I could not stand. In a few minutes my mother came running upstairs and put a little bundle into my hands. I opened it very quickly, and what did I see but a little hoe, rake, spade, and wheelbarrow. I thought that I could never thank my mother enough. When she saw how pleased I was, she told me that I should have a piece of ground, and she would get me some seeds, and that she would also immediately make me a gardening dress, so that I could commence the next day. Oh, how I longed for the morrow to come, and when the morning dawned I was almost crazy. My mother put on my dress, and giving me my tools, took me into the garden, where I took my first lesson in gardening. I thought it was delightful. My mother told me that I should soon get along very fast, and that I should plant some flower and vegetable seeds. I felt very smart, and began to work away quite industriously, making improvement in the looks of my garden. When my mother appeared and told me breakfast was ready, I could hardly believe it, the time had passed so quickly. The next morning my mother waked me at 5:30, and dressing me, took me out. As we were going along to the garden, we saw by the roadside a flock of geese, and as we passed along they set up a tremendous hissing. Oh, how frightened I was! But my mother laughed at my fears and told me not to be afraid, as they would not hurt me. When I got to the garden I was all of a tremble, and for 5 minutes I could not do anything. I got the garden all finished that morning, before breakfast, and so I went in, and changing my dress, went out to take a walk. As I went along the paths I could not help feeling overcome. It was a beautiful spring morning. The dew was on the grass, and the birds were singing their morning song of praise to the Maker of all things, as they soared towards heaven. When my breakfast bell rang, I came in and told my mother of my pleasant walk, and she seemed very glad. The next morning my mother showed me how to plant seeds, after which she watered them, as she said the watering pot was too large for me, but that she was going to buy me one so that I could water my plants when they came up. In a day or two my mother, her governess, and I went into the city and bought me a little watering pot and a little book that treated of gardening, which I put with my other books. One morning, about 2 weeks after planting my seeds, I was surprised to see several little green things, which I thought were weeds, and I was just going to pull them up when I happened to think that perhaps they might not be weeds after all, and that I would stop and ask my mother. My mother appearing up the gravel walks just then, I asked her what they were, and she told me that they were the plants just beginning to come up, and that I must water them every morning carefully, and soon they would come up higher and higher. Then the leaves would come out, and at last little buds would shoot forth and turn into flowers. But in order to have them do so, I must keep all the weeds away from them, water them morning and evening, and put up sticks for the running ones. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Memoirs of a Country Doll by Mary Curtis. Blackberrying. At 6 the next morning we both got up, that is, my mother and I, and began dressing ourselves. "Stop, Josephine," said she. "Don't put on that dress, as you are not going out into the garden this morning." "Why not?" said I, but I began to take off my dress. "Because," said my mother, "Geraldine Norton has invited me to a blackberrying, and you are to go." "Oh, Mother, I am so glad! that I don't know what to do with myself. But what dress am I to wear?" "Oh, wear your purple calico." In half an hour we were dressed, had our breakfast eaten, and were ready to go. I was so impatient to be off that I thought we should never go. Pretty soon Celeste, my mother, said she saw them coming, and sure enough there they were, a whole troop of boys and girls, with their pails and baskets. Celeste took me up in her arms and ran with me down the carriage-way, not without having brought her pail and mine. We next called for a dozen more girls and boys at their houses. At 8 o'clock we had got about a couple of miles from the place. Antoinette Leland suddenly screamed out, "Here he comes! Here he comes!" "What comes?" cried they all. "The bull! The bull!" said Antoinette. And sure enough there was a monstrous large bull coming in double quick time right behind them. Such a scampering! Pell-mell went the whole troop to escape the pursuer. At last we saw a little cave not very far off, and all made a rush for that. When my mother screamed out to George Glover, "Throw off that red scarf, George, or else the bull will gore you to death. Look, see how he foams and how madly he paws the ground." The scarf was off in an instant, and the bull, rushing upon it, began tearing it into 1,000 pieces. While he was doing this, we had time to get out of his sight before he made another attempt to attack us. We soon got to the burying place, and then we began to pick and talk in earnest. The theme of the conversation was about the bull, and how nicely they got away from him. George Glover made a wreath of leaves and presented it to Celeste, telling her that she was his guardian angel. Celeste gave him a box on the ear, but they both laughed heartily. In a few moments they heard screams, and beheld one of the girls rolling down the hill, and all her berries spilt. One of the boys, however, stopped her, and all joined in filling her basket again. At noon we all had dinner, each of the party bringing something, under a group of trees. The dinner was an excellent one. We brought clear, cool water from the spring, and squeezed berries into it. We had meats and everything that we could want to make a gypsy dinner. One of the boys, Charles Hammond, to improve the repast, took a jew's harp out of his pocket and played several tunes, beginning with "God Save the Queen" and ending with an air from Linda de Chamonix. His performance was loudly cheered. Bella Barker, one of the gayest of the girls, then got up and made a speech, which was also clapped and cheered. The dinner was then finished, and we went to pick some more berries to make up for the ones we had eaten. On our way home my mother and all the rest stopped to pick wildflowers, when Lornette Edwards ran forward to gather a little blue and white flower which was a little before her. Suddenly she began to scream, and running to the place where she stood, we found ourselves in no very pleasant situation, as we had got upon a marshy place, and were over our shoes in mud and water. We all began scrambling out as fast as we could, and turned our faces the other way. We went to a little spring that we saw, and taking off our shoes and stockings, gave them a washing out, for we said that we preferred to have wet stockings and shoes on our feet to muddy ones. After going a little way, we saw a wild cherry tree, up which the boys soon scrambled, and threw down the fruit into our aprons. We got home about 6 o'clock, having been gone 11 hours. I felt very tired, and was glad to have my supper and get into bed. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Memoirs of a Country Doll by Mary Curtis. Balls, parties, etc. About a week after my dresses were made, my mother said that we were going to the opera that night, and the opera was going to be Robert di Diable. Oh, how glad I was! I almost went out my wits for joy, for now I knew that I should see some most splendid things. I was dressed in a blue silk, with an opera cloak and hood. My mother was dressed so also. At last we came to the opera. Oh, how my heart beat! After sitting a little while, the musicians began to play. Oh, such music! I felt as if I never wanted to go home, but wanted to stay there all my life. My mother then told me to hark and try to hear a little bell that would ring very soon. I listened, and in a minute I heard it ring, and then ring again, and then the curtain was pulled up. The most beautiful singing that ever I heard was sung that night. I felt as if I was above the clouds and listening to angels instead of mortals. By and by the curtain came down, and then my mother told me that was the end of the opera, but there was to be a ballet soon. I now had an opportunity to look round the house. The place was immense, and was filled with people. I never saw so many before in all my life, and I never could have believed that so many persons could be got into one place. Pretty soon we had the ballet, and if I was pleased with the singing, I was still more so with the dancing. The ballet was La Sylphide, and Taglioni took the principal part. We got home about 1 o'clock, and I laid till 10 the next morning. I was so sleepy. In a couple of weeks my mother took me to the Earl of Egmont's ball, where we had a most superb supper. There were about 600 persons there, and I passed a most delightful night. I got home at 12 o'clock. I thanked my mother next morning for all her kindness to me, and she told me in the future that I should accompany her to all the balls she went to. So I went to a great many balls and parties, to which I owe my present polished manners. Even in the midst of their gaiety I had not forgotten my mother, Emma Arthurst, and my sister Ellen, and was on the point of asking my present mother to let me go and see them, when she came running into the room and said, "Dear Josie, here is a letter for you from your last mother, Emma." It ran thus. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Memoirs of a Country Doll by Mary Curtis. Doll's Correspondence. Dear Josie, I at last thought that I would write you. I hope you have not quite forgotten your last mamma, for I have not forgotten you. Your sister Ellen still continued the same bad girl, and so I sent her to a ragman who gave me a shilling for her, though I guess he will repent of his bargain before long if she acts as naughty as she has with me. I am very busy now. I help my mother in a great many things, and am quite useful to her. From Emily Arthurst. I wrote back an answer, which was this: Dear Mother Emily, indeed I have not forgotten you, as you thought. Although I have everything I can wish for, jewelry, clothes, and food, yet I can never forget the happy year I passed with you. I had hoped that my sister Ellen would have reformed, but I am very sorry that she has not. My present mamma is very kind to me. She has taken me to the opera and to balls and parties. From your affectionate daughter, that was, Josephine Arnoldson. About a week after, I received another letter, which read thus: My dear daughter, I am very much pleased to hear that you still remember me as well as I remember you, and that you hope that Ellen would reform. I hope you enjoy yourself where you are, and see as many nice things as you can wish. Enclosed, I send you a nice little pen for you to write me letters with, once a week, if your mamma will let you. From your late mother, Emily Arthurst. I answered it: Dear Mother, I am very much pleased with my pen, and my present mother has given me leave to write once a week. Josephine Arnoldson. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of a Country Doll by Mary Curtis. The Seashore. My mother Celeste once took me down to Ramsgate, thinking, as she said, that I needed sea bathing. She packed her clothes and mine, and ordered my house, the baby house, to be carried behind her. The next morning my mother rode in her carriage, which was made expressly for herself and me, to the waterside, where we went into a little house, and putting on our bathing clothes, jumped into the water. My mother had fastened me by a string to her waist, and so could swim without being troubled by me. She then showed me how to keep myself above water, and how to swim, for she said that soon she was going to let me bathe alone. I enjoyed the water very much, and thought what a great loss it must be to some dolls who cannot go into the water because their complexion will not allow them to be washed in anything but sweet oil or butter. I thought how sticky it must feel during the process, and how uncomfortable it must be afterwards. We went into the little house again after bathing, and put on our skirts and dresses. All day it was very hot, and we remained in the house reading until evening, when we went to bathe again. While bathing, I saw several large birds fly over the water, and several times dip down into the waves. I asked my mother what they were, and she said they were seagulls. The next morning, when we were in the midst of bathing, there was a cry of, "A shark! A shark!" As soon as this was said, everyone started for shore, and all got there safely except one little girl, about 9 years of age, who was so frightened that she could not swim. The shark was nearing to her every moment. At last a strong and brave man jumped into the water, and swimming up to the shark, killed him with a long knife which he carried in his belt. After a couple weeks spent in this manner, we went home. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In about a month, I had a terrible accident, which I am about to relate. One summer afternoon, as I was looking out the window, I fell out of it into a winding stream, where I lay floating down I don't know where. I was so stunned by the fall that I fainted, and did not recover myself till I'd floated down some miles. When I recovered, I found that I was in the hands of some fishermen. They were not regular fishermen, but only angling for sport, who examined me very attentively. At last one said, "I'm sure I don't know what to do with this little doll." "Oh," said the other one, "there goes a little milkmaid. Let's give it to her." "So I say," said the first. "Here, little girl, don't you want a doll? If you do, here's one." "Thank you, sir," said my new mother, whose name was Agnes Earle. "I am very much obliged to you." So Agnes took me home. She was a very pretty little girl. She had black eyes, black hair, and a dark complexion. I passed a very pleasant life with my new mother. She used often to talk to me in a very motherly way, such as this: "My dear Josephine, I am very glad to see you behave so well, and I'm very sorry that I cannot bring you into a better society than I can. However, I think that we had better not worry about it, as you are almost polished enough." My mother used to talk to me in this way of evenings, and I hope I profited by some of her lectures to me on goodness. My mother used to often give me baths, to which I think I owe my good health. One afternoon, after my mother had bathed me, as was her usual custom, and had laid me in the sun to dry, 2 little girls came along and picked me up. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Holla, here's a doll. I'll have it, said the biggest girl, whose name was Martha Griggs. No, you won't either. So there you told a lie, said Madge Griggs. I'm the oldest and ought to have it, screamed Martha. And I'm the youngest, and the oldest ought to give up to the smallest one, said Madge. You shan't, you imprudent jade, so you may just clear out of the way, yelled Martha, striking her sister with all her might. Oh, how you have hurt me. I shall tell Mother of you as soon as we get home, said Madge. I don't care if you do, miss, said Martha. Then they went home, Martha with the doll, and Madge followed behind her all the way. I thought that I was very unfortunate in the change of my mammas, for, thought I can't pass a very pleasant time with these quarrelsome mammas, and I'm afraid that I might have my legs, or arms, or even my head broken in a fray, which I should not like very much. At last we came to the house where they lived, and then we had supper, and I was put to bed. I cried very much that night, for I was sad at leaving my little mother Agnes, and I felt bad at having such a quarrelsome mothers as I had now. I never could get a moment's peace, for if one of my mothers wanted me put to bed, the other one wanted me to get up. I can remember one day what a quarrel occurred, and these were the words as nearly as I can recollect. Madge, where's my doll? It's not your doll. That's a lie. It ain't. I'll have that doll. You won't. I found it in the grass. I'm the youngest and ought to have it. Father says you ought to give up to the youngest. Will you tell me where that doll is? For I want to put its apron on. Aha! You won't get it now if you want to put its apron on, for I'm going to put its worst dress on, so as to let it slabber in the dirt. No, you won't either! And Martha gave Madge slap after slap, and slap after slap, till I thought that Madge would never see light again. That night, when I went to bed, I thought how much better it would have been for Martha to have kindly asked Madge for me, and for Madge to have answered kindly. And I hope that all my readers will never imitate Madge and Martha. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The next day after the quarrel, my mother said that the children during recess at school were going to make a snowman, and that they would take me to school with them. At 12, they had their recess, when Martha, not finding her scarf as usual, laid the loss of it to Madge, and said, You, Madge, what have you done with my scarf? Bring it here. I have not done anything with it, said Madge. You lie, was the coarse and unladylike retort. At last Martha found her scarf, hanging on her nail with her cloak over it. When we got into the yard, my mother's brushed away the snow from a little place on the steps, and set me down there to see the making of the snowman. The manner of making it was thus. They each took a small snowball, and rolled it into the snow, over and over, and then they joined all together and made one large ball. They then took a stick and made a couple of holes in the ball for eyes, and made a straight mark, rather deep, for its mouth, and then took a piece of snow and made it into a nose, as well as they could, and fastened it on. Then they made another ball, considerably larger than the first, for his body. Legs and arms were also fastened upon the body. When this was all done, they gave 3 cheers and went into the schoolroom. When my mother got home, they thought that they would try to make a snowman such as the boys had made in the schoolyard. They had got the head made, and were looking after a stick with which to make the eyes and mouth, when down came the head upon Madge, knocking her down to the ground and covering her up with snow. As soon as she had extricated herself, she let loose her tongue, and another scene and storm of words flowed after their usual manner. Such frequent disputes as these made me regret more and more my previous home, and long to make some change, which I thought must certainly be for the better. But the time had not yet come. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The next week, the children's teacher said that he would take them to the theater, for they had behaved so well. I thought differently. There was nothing talked of but the theater from morning till night, and I am sorry to say that this was a subject of dispute, too. One said they would get the first bill and have theirs read through first, and the other was going to hear the bell jingle first and sit in the front seat. One was going to be looked at the most and be dressed first, and the other was going to get into the carriage first and get the best seat, and so on. The day at length arrived. I felt happy too, though there was such a dispute, for I remembered when I went to the opera with my late mother, Celeste Belmont, and how I enjoyed myself. The children were in high spirits, and kept incessantly talking of what a nice time they would have if only they were there now. I longed to tell them to have a little patience, but I was afraid I should get my neck broke if I did so. At length, the maid arrived to dress them, and in their hurry to get up the stairs before each other, Madge tumbled down the stairs, but did not hurt her much. Such dressings! Why, you would almost think their clothes flew off, as they did their buttons, and hurried to get dressed before each other. Martha got dressed first, and then she went for me. I was in a pink muslin with blue roses in my hair, and my mother thought that I looked splendidly. We lived out of town, and had to ride into the city, so we had a very nice ride. We went to the Covent Garden Theatre. It is a splendid place, but not so pretty as the Royal Italian Opera House, where I went with my mother, Celeste Belmont. There was some scrambling to get to the front seat between Madge and Martha, but at last it was settled. We sat in a stage box, which was beautiful. The play began. There was once a beautiful young girl, and she had 2 lovers. She liked one, and the other she didn't like. And there were meetings and tumbling down places, and all that sort of thing. At last, this pretty young girl married the lover she liked, and the other lover went away, when I tumbled onto the stage in a bouquet which they threw, though they did not know that they had thrown me. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. I was now in the hands of a pretty little danseuse, who ran with me into the green room, saying, "Oh, Mother, see this beautiful dolly that was thrown to me in a bouquet? Isn't it pretty?" "Yes," said her mother, "it is very pretty, but hadn't you better put it down and go to the dance, Cracovien, which you have got to dance?" "Certainly, Mother, as soon as I've got my heels on." I found out soon afterwards that it was her dancing heels. My new mother's name was Caroline Edgrave. We soon went home in a very nice house, where we were boarded. That night how thankful I was that I had gotten away from Madge and Martha, for now I felt I should enjoy myself very much. And besides that, I should see behind the scenes, and be in the dressing room which I had often wished for. The next day, my mother took me to the rehearsal, and when she began to dance, she put me beside one of the wings, so that I might learn to dance. We lived out in the country, about 10 miles south of my late mother's house, in a very neat cottage. My new mother taught me a great many fancy dances, among which were La Kasasha, La Cracovien, La Smolenska, Highland Fling, and a great many hornpipes, besides quadrilles, polkas, waltz, and the mazurka, redwoa, and schottische. My mother was to dance and act in a new pantomime, which was called The Elements and Fairies, and which she was determined to have me act in. So she asked the manager if he could not have me do something in it. The manager consented, and when my mother told me, oh, how happy I felt! My mother took me to the rehearsal every day with her and made me a dress. It was of white gauze over white satin, with gold spangles and a gold paper crown on my head. Of course I had little silver shoes and fleshings. I was to represent the fairies' guard in the clouds, and appear in a sun. I at first felt rather giddy when I mounted the pedal behind the sun, but soon I got accustomed to it. I appeared to a lover in a dream. I did not feel degraded, and I hope my readers will not think less of me. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The evening arrived. We drove into town rather earlier than usual. My mother let me peep through a little slit in the curtain to see if the house was full. The play commenced, and it was as follows. First, there came a most beautiful fairy and said, "Elements, I beg your aid. Come forward, and be not afraid." Immediately, a waterfall that was pouring over some rocks divided, and a most beautiful fairy came out and said, "Queen, I come to thy command. What wouldst thou have?" "Be patient, spirit." Then the fairy of air appeared and said, "Queen, what wouldst thou? Be patient." Then the fairy of earth came right out of the floor and said, "O queen, I come at thy call. Be patient." Then the spirit of fire came forth out of a rock with a loud hissing noise and said, "What would you have me do? I'll burn down houses and land, nor deal with a partial hand." "Stop," said the queen. None of this. Instead of hurting, I want you to befriend a poor young man who goes to get the talismanic wand, which will put him in the possession of the most beautiful princess in the world. Therefore, I request that you shall aid him." Then they all answered, "Whatever is thy will, we do." The next scene was wood, where this young man passes through and is attacked by demons, snakes, bears, and all sorts of bad things. At length he goes to sleep, and I appear to him in the sun, and hold a scroll which says on it, "Persevere! The fairies thy guardians are ever near." Then the scene changes to a demon's place of resort. Here is all fire, and demons with square faces, and some with humpbacks, and some with goggle eyes, claws, wings, and tails. The king then said, "Ye devils of lower regions, come forward." And instantly a whole troop of devils of all shapes and sizes came forward. He then told them that he wanted them to exert themselves, and to try to keep that young man from getting the wand, so that he could not get the princess. Then one of the devils said that he would go and misguide him, and so he dressed up as a handsome young man, and went and met this man that was going to get the wand, and said, "Friend, where goest thou?" "I go seek the wand." "You do? Why then, you've got the wrong path." "I have. Why, 'twas only a minute ago that an old man said I had gone the right path, if I went to seek the wand." "Do not believe him. He lies. That is the way which lies open before. Take that path there. Adieu." The young man that was to seek the wand said, "How lucky that I had met that man, for if I had not, I should have gone the wrong way, and missed the princess forever." Then there was a clashing sound, and I appeared in the sun, and held another scroll which said, "That young man is a demon in disguise, and has led you into the wrong path. Take this ball and throw it before you, and wherever it rolls, you follow." I threw him down a ball. He then followed the ball and disappeared. The next scene was where the fairies were, and they sung splendidly. Presently, the queen came through the air riding a chariot drawn by peacocks. She said, "Listen, fairies." Then the fairies said, "We will." The queen said, "The young man will soon reach the place where the wand is kept. I wish you to help him across the golden lake. Now disperse." Then all the fairies disappeared. The next scene was where the demons were again, and the demons screamed horribly, and the king came through the air in a coach drawn by serpents, and said, "Hark, demons." And the demons said, "We will." The king said, "The young man who will soon be at the palace in spite of our endeavors is to cross the golden lake, and I wish you to do in all your power to prevent him from getting that wand. Now go." And all the devils went. The next scene was at the palace, where the wand was kept, and the young man got the wand in spite of all the devils and bats and owls, serpents, dragons, and ghosts. As soon as he had got the wand in his hands, the devils all uttered in a scream and went through the floor, and a chariot came through the air with the princess, who was my mother, and the fairy queen. The scene changed into a most beautiful garden, with the palace of the sun at the back, and the sun over it, and I in it. All the performers were on stage at once, and danced a fairy dance. This ended the pantomime, or rather spectacle, for nearly all spoke. After the performance, a little girl came into the dressing room, and her father and mother. My mother saw that she cast longing eyes at me, and so she stepped up and said, "Will you be so kind to accept this doll?" The little girl said she would. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. We then drove home. My mother's name was Garoflina Shoppard. They were a very vulgar, purse-proud, stuck-up people. My little mother was all the time talking to me about money, and making a show. We went to a party one night. My mother's mother, my grandmother, did not know how to dress in a good taste at all. She was dressed in black and yellow changeable silk, and my mother was dressed in a green and orange, with a wreath of red roses in her hair. My grandmother tried to talk in French, but she mispronounced every word. That evening, when anyone was introduced, she would ask them if they could barely cow frogs' hay. And at supper, she said that she would take chocolat. It was such a soul-stirring beverage. She took ice cream and said that she always took ice cream because she thought it cooled her heterogeneous and amalgamated system. Besides, it was the very merry month of Juin. At home, when we had company, she always talked so. We had some pretty high folks, for she had worked her way into the upper 10. One evening, Sir Thomas Fitzpatrick came to see her. At tea she said, "Dear sir, let me persuade you to take one airy mouthful of farm boyses, or else do consent to taste some formage. It's quite new, my lord, and I hope it will please your diddle-de-troy taste." After tea she said, "Oh, my lord, don't you perfectly adore Bryan and Shakespeare? I think that one is so cherubimbical, and the other so seraphical. Don't you recollect that passage from Macbeth in Act 2nd and Scene 2nd? Hark, who lies I the second chamber. And in Hamlet's soliloquy in Scene 5th, Act 1st, alas, poor ghost." My little mother used to prink me before the glass and hold me up to see how handsome I was, till I was very tired of looking at myself. My mother never let me do any sewing, for fear I should spoil my fingers, and thus I passed a very idle life. I could not read much, as my mother was afraid that I would hurt my eyes. One day my mother said that her grandmother was coming to live with us, and also her aunt, who was not married. She said that she hated old maids, though they had to come, but she would not speak to them. I was very sorry indeed to hear this. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. One day, before her grandmother and aunt came, my fine mother, Gariflina, told me that she had been invited to a nutting. But as a nutting was so low a pastime, she had half a mind not to go. Her mother, however, told her she would cut such a grand show, that she had better go. So she had consented, and was going to take me with her. The next morning, my mother was up early, and awoke me, when the following conversation was held. "Josie, my dear, I think that you had better have on your silk dress, as I want you to make a grand show," said my mother. "But," said I, "hadn't I better wear another, as I may spoil it?" "Why, child, what can you be thinking of? Don't you want to make a show?" "Yes, mother, but I had rather take comfort than make a show." "Stop! Do as I have bid you, and say no more about it." In the course of an hour, my mother and I had got dressed, and as we descended into the dining room, Gariflina's mother said to her, "My dear, the young misses and masters have all been waiting here for some time, and I told them that you were not up yet, and so they waited." "Dear me, how sorry I am," said my mother in her most effective tone, "to have given these young ladies and gentlemen the affliction of waiting for me." "Not at all," they politely replied. We now started, and as we got out of the door, my mother started back and said, "Mercy on me, haven't you any carriage or barouche for us to ride in? I shall be so extremely and exceedingly fatigued." However, they had not, and so we started along, Gariflina all the time laminating that she had not got her landau with her, and as she would die very soon. In an hour or so, we got to the woods, where we sat down to rest ourselves. While thus resting, we heard a very loud screaming, and turning in the direction of the cry, there we saw my mother, Gariflina, screeching with all her might. "Oh, save me, save me!" she cried. All the boys and girls ran to her and asked her what was the matter. "Oh, the spider, the spider!" she screamed, and upon looking, they found a very small spider on her dress, and she, instead of shaking it off, began to scream lusciously. I thought my mother was very foolish to make so much ado about a little spider, but I did not tell her so. Gariflina, being rid of the spider, began to gather nuts with the rest of the party. But then she tore her dress on a bramble bush, and had her veil torn off by the boughs, which accidents made her so ill-humored that they all secretly agreed never to invite her again. As they were going home, they saw a drove of cows before them, which made my mother run and scream like a maniac. One of the little girls said that they were her mother's cows, and that if they would come into the cow yard, they could see them milked. None of the party hesitated but Gariflina, who said that she did not want to go into a dirty old cow yard. Soon, however, she had changed her mind and went. I had seen cows milked at my mother's house. I mean Agnes Earle's. But I enjoyed the scene before me very much. First, half of the girls tried, and then the other half. And then half of the boys, and then the other half. When it came to Gariflina's turn, she went about it so awkwardly that it made them all laugh. She splattered a shower of milk over upon her dress. The cow knocked her down, and when she got up, she was indeed a sight. Her dress and veil were torn, and splattered with dirt, and her dress was all covered with spots where the milk had been splattered upon her. When she got home, she complained of the ill treatment she had received, and her mother said that she should never go again to a nutting. When I went to sleep that night, I prayed that I might be delivered from such a mother, and be placed in the hands of a better one, who had more sense, and was not so ill-humored and proud. Early next morning, my mother told me sorrowfully that her old aunt and grandmother were coming next week, for which I was quite sorry for my mother, for I thought that I had enough of troubles. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In a week, they arrived. The old maid was a quiddling thing, and the grandmother was always saying that she could never get a cold. And then she would tell how she got it. One day, this aunt, her name was Bestie Harper, said to my mother, "Do you make your doll's hair curl a little more in the front, and tie her shoestring a little longer? And there! Do you fix her apron string? I hate to see it touch the placket hole." "Oh," said her grandmother, "never mind, Bestie. If you had such a cold as I've got, I never can get rid of it." "Do stop," said Bestie. This aunt objected to my having my soup eaten so quick. She always allowed herself 5 minutes to have it eaten, and no more nor less. Then I was to hold my spoon just so, and only to put half a spoonful in at a time, for she had known little girls, and she said, why not dolls as well as girls, to be choked in taking a whole spoonful at a time. Nor must I take a quarter of a spoonful, as I would not have my soup eaten in 5 minutes. I am sorry to say that I often wished that this aunt was in the Red Sea, and not very near dry land, but I suppose that it was all meant for my good. One evening, there was company, and one lady took me up and said, "This is a beautiful doll, but don't you think that she would be handsomer if she had her hair curled a little closer, and if one of her nostrils was a little better shaped, and if one of her eyes was a little higher and blacker?" said Bestie Harper. "I don't know, I'm sure," said the lady. At this moment, Garflina came up and said that if the lady would be pleased to accept of the doll and carry it home to her little girl, that she would be very much obliged to her. The lady thanked Garflina and said that Amelia would be very much pleased with me. I hoped that my new mother would take good care of me and would love me very much. Whether she did or not, you will hear it in the next chapter. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. "Amelia, see what I've bought you," said Mrs. Joyce to her little girl. "What is it, Mother?" "A most beautiful little doll." "Oh, goody! Mother, how glad I am!" "Well, my little girl, I am glad to see that you like the doll. But wait till morning, and then you can see her plainly." The next day was occupied in admiring me. Her mother said, "Amelia, now you must be very careful of this doll. Her name is Josephine Arnoldson." "Oh, yes, Mother, I shall be very careful of her indeed." But in a week, my mother began to be rather careless of me. She left me all around the house, and very often left me in the barn and in the woodhouse all night. One day, when as usual, she had left me on the sofa, a fat old lady came in and sat on me, and broke one of my arms. All the time that she was sitting on me, she hurt me dreadfully, and I could not speak, she suffocated me so. After she had gone, my mother found me and said, Oh, my dear child, how much you must have suffered to have had old Mrs. Jones sit on you, and I do declare if your arm is not broken." Her mother, who was stood by, said, "Amelia, she would not have been broken if you had not left her about. In future, you must look out where you leave her, and tonight I will get your father to mend her arm." My next accident was thus. Amelia's brother took me by the arm and flung me around the room, and then suddenly let me drop and cracked a piece out of my head. I was taken to a shop where I had my head mended. One can scarcely notice the mark, except a very little white spot, wider than the rest of my body. One day, Amelia was washing me, and she held me too near to the fire to dry me, when my hair caught, and in a moment was all in flames. I screamed with all my might, and so did my mother, and her nursery maid caught me up, and soused me with a basin of water. Such a fright as I was! My hair was all burned off. It was some time before I got over my fright and pain. The next week, I was taken to the city, where a barberess made me another wig. One day, a large Newfoundland dog took me up in his mouth and ran away with me only in fun. But I was terribly frightened. In a day, he brought me home again, much to the relief of my mother and myself. My mother told me that she had suffered very much for my absence, and she was going to give me up for lost, for one of her servants said that she had better hunt for me, but after a while she said she couldn't. When her maid came running up with me and said that she had just found me on the front doorstep. In a month, I had my right leg broken very badly, but after a while, it got well again. My mother carried me out to a walk, when the same dog snatched me away and took me to my present mother. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Memoirs of a Country Doll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My new mother's name was Violet LaGrange, and she was very much pleased with me and showed me all around the house. Everyone else seemed pleased with me too, especially Lily, her younger sister, who patted the dog and called him a real good dog, and many other names. The place where I now live is called LaGrange Place, and is a most beautiful mansion house, with parks and everything else befitting such a splendid place. My new mother made me dresses, and got me a little house in which I can live. I think I shall never have any other mamma, for she told her little sister that she should have me, when she herself is too old to play with me. I have formed an acquaintance with another doll, who lives a little way from here. Her name is Maria Poppet, and her mother is Lucy Ashbourne, the most intimate friend of my mother. For Maria, I entertain a most lively friendship, and when our mammas are playing round, we relate to each other our adventures. Maria's adventures you may read in a volume entitled The London Doll. I now close, hoping that my readers will find as much pleasure in reading my adventures as they have had in reading Maria's. End of chapter 20.